Sweet. Thank you so much, Jon, for agreeing to talk to me. For everyone watching, I'm interviewing Jon Kuperman today, who I have known indirectly for probably like 6 years now. But yeah, thank you so much for being on. And if you'd like to introduce yourself and
Yeah, man, thanks for having me. Yeah, my name is Jon Kuperman. I was working at Adobe for the last 4 years, and before that, I was working at the Brave browser, and before that, Twitter. Taking a little break between things right now. Yeah, I've been doing like JavaScript and web performance for a long time, and I do as much teaching as I can on the side. So like blog posts, workshops, conference talks, things like that. And I
Awesome.
run a JavaScript conference in Hawaii called JSConf Hawaii, which is very
Awesome.
fun.
Cool. Yeah, so today I wanted to talk to you about tooling and performance.
Yeah.
I originally found I had a job in San Francisco at a consultancy, and I saw your class at, what was the co-working space on
Oh,
off Howard Street?
yeah. Oh man,
You
I'm
know what I'm
blanking
talking
on it.
you know what I'm
Was
talking
was
about?
it was that Galvanize?
Yes, it was Galvanize. It was
Yeah.
Galvanize. So I saw your course in Galvanize, and I was like, "Hey, work, send me to this course. It seems really cool." So met you there, and tooling using Chrome DevTools and tooling for developers is, I've never seen anyone do that and have that as a focus. How did you get into web performance and tooling?
Yeah. So it's a little twofold. I think for the most part it was I got like pretty early in my career, I got a job where I was way out of my depth. So I was like working on this like very complicated app at a company called Barracuda Networks, and we were doing this like very complex like backup and storage program, which was like allowing people to back up their virtual machines and enterprise hard drives and things like that, and then we would do all this like cloud storage efficiency stuff, and I was like way out of my depth. So I had this mentor there, and I would try like really hard not to waste a lot of his time with questions every day. So I got like really, really comfortable in the developer tools. By the time I would meet with him, I'd have like, my stack traces out, I'd have breakpoints in, I'd have little notes that I wrote down. So it was a little bit by necessity where I was like working on something that was really difficult for me, just like trace through and figure out. And then at the same time, there was a course way back in the day on a site called Code School, which was like this really cool, like learn to code site. And they would do these like funny, they had like Rails for zombies where you would like build a Rails app and it was all zombie
Oh yeah,
themed.
I
But
remember that. Yeah.
I think it might have been Paul Irish from the Chrome DevTools team. It was somebody from their team had done an intro to Chrome DevTools class on there. But the problem was like and this is still kind of a problem, but they changed their UI so much that a lot of the stuff in his course was really hard to follow. So like one of the first things I did was I was just updating as I went through the course. I was just kind of updating stuff as I figured out where it was and writing a lot of that stuff down. And eventually I turned that into a workshop, which was like kind of a rehashing of his original course. But then I always say this in my workshops, but they really kind of give you superpowers. Like I kind of started falling in love with the dev tools for like coming into new teams and always like kind of surprising people with the context I would have in their apps. And like the truth is that I'm not a very exceptional programmer. I'm just like really good at using these tools. And so like I've just kind of fell in love with it that way and started doing as much like kind of like reading their docs and engaging with their team, who are all really friendly. And then turning it into like workshops, conference talks, things like that. I like with the conference talks, I do like like 10 things you didn't know DevTools could do, kind of, quick stuff. And then with the workshops, I usually do a full like how to, performance audit or debug complicated apps, all sorts of stuff like that.
Awesome. So you learned through talking to the Chrome DevTools team? Is that hear that right?
Yeah, they were really great. They're still really great. They still like engage on Twitter like all the time if you have like a
Awesome.
question or anything like that. Nowadays they actually have just amazing technical writers, so I get a lot from their technical blog posts. That a lot of them are on web.dev. But even still, the folks there, like when it comes to like talking about memory leaks or like CPU monitoring or throttling, stuff like that, yeah, like talking with those folks is just awesome, and they always seem happy to engage. So yeah, it's been
Awesome.
a great source for me.
That's awesome. And so you mentioned this, you said DevTools gives you superpowers in your talks. Can you dive into that a little bit more and talk
Yeah.
about how it helps developers being proficient
Yeah.
with
Like
DevTools?
one example that I always give, and this is another one that like a lot of people don't know about, is like, so in the elements panel of DevTools, where you see the HTML structure, you can right click on any one of those elements and you can actually set what they call DOM breakpoints. And so what that does is, hey, if this DOM element changes in any way, show me the JavaScript that caused it to happen. And so like one example of like superpowers would be like, I had this job while I was at Twitter and I came onto this new team and they were doing a lot of charting, like graphs, tables, stuff like that. And they were having some problems where the data was getting duplicated into the tables. And like normally that would be, there's just whatever, it's just tough for a beginner, right? To be like, all right, well, what language is this in? How does it work? What framework does it use? All these different things. But on my first day, I was able to just set a DOM breakpoint on one of the table cells and then find, Chrome DevTools will then pause and show you the exact line of JavaScript that's updating that breakpoint. So like within, 20 minutes, I'm already like in the proper file, it's like a backbone app back in the day or whatever. But, things like that, where it's like, a different take, like it's a different way of looking at applications as opposed to like, going to GitHub, cloning it, starting in the index.js, trying to see what the dependency, this is very different where you're like, hey, like what made that repaint happen? Or like, what is taking so long? Or like, why is the CPU, idling, stuff like that.
Right. That's awesome. Yeah. I don't know how you feel about it, but when I'll do your workshop or go on to your front end master's course and I'll be like, wow, this is all gold. And then I'll write down the things I need to do and then I'll use them a few times and then forget like 60% of it and then have to
Yeah.
go. Like I forgot about the DOM breakpoint and that could have helped me yesterday.
Yeah, that's really true. I struggle with that too. Like I even like will struggle where like I'll give advice that it's hard for me to follow. So like I'll give advice on like console logs versus debugger statements and be like, yeah,
Okay.
like if you're like just needing to log something simple, or if logging is really the end, like you want to see just what string it is, that's great. But if you want to play around more like back and forth, like hopping through time or explore more variables in scope at that time, like a debugger is the way to go. And then I'll catch myself like in a very frustrated mood at work, console logging like 80 things. I can't remember which files and which ones. So then I'm like console logging the file name above the console. And I'm like, oh man, I really need to like stick to my own advice. So that's really tough. And I think that's just a tough thing about programming is like we get excited and we kind of tunnel vision on something or whatever. And it gets really hard to like take a step back and be like, do I know any tools that would help with this? Like that's super tough for sure. Yeah, I struggle with that a lot.
Totally. That's funny. I'll console log like here.
Yep.
And then I'll do it again in another file.
Yep.
And then I'll be like, wait, what?
Yep. Yeah. It's really tough. And then like, yeah, when you finally remember to put the debugger in, it's like, oh, it's just so much nicer. But
right, totally.
When you're like, because yeah, just a lot of times debugging, you feel like you're just one log away from having the bug off.
Right.
So you're like kind of chasing it. But yeah, I think it's just really good to try to condition yourself to like take a step back whenever you get stuck like that. Totally. Sometimes I do weird tricks that I've always done. Like I'll draft up a message to a coworker asking for help that I have no intention on sending. But the act of like drafting it, putting it together, thinking it through, and I'll really write it. Like I'll open it in Slack and I'll, open a DM with somebody and be like, hey, do you have any idea, like, why is this getting called when this happens? And then I'll try answering the questions, that I know they're going to ask, like, oh, what did you try? Or, stuff like that. And like, I find that like kind of rubber duckying helps a lot. So I will try to do things like that, but I'm far from perfect at it. Like I'll often just 100 console logs and keep going. Yep.
I love that. I'm gonna try that. I'll open up a bunch of DMs with people and try and solve my problems. That's awesome.
Yeah.
So you not only talk about Chrome DevTools, you talk about performance as well.
Yeah.
How important do you think performance is for front-end and engineers in general, but we can talk about front-end specifically to know?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the problem is that it's just so easy for things to get out of hand these days, where like we still don't have like very good at, like people talk about really good ideas. Like I think performance budgeting is a great idea. So if you have your app set up so that, and I've seen projects do this, but they're few and far between, but so that like each PR, it tells you what the total bundle size is or something like that. And that just really helps, right? People will know what they're doing. But by and large, most apps don't do anything like that. Like if you ask somebody how big their main JavaScript bundle is, I would wager that most people would not be able to tell you offhand or even get close. So when it comes to performance, like I don't think that like knowing weird quirks, like I'll always see people talking about, like compiler optimizations or whatever. Be like, oh, did you know in this language, if you have like more than 8 parameters, it deops or, anything like that. Like, I don't think that's important unless you know it, unless it's your job, right? Like, but when it comes to like a team culture of not just grabbing anything off NPM, and if it works, not looking at the performance budget, or like things that are optional, but maybe they shouldn't be, like splitting your Webpack bundle up, where it's like people are like, oh yeah, I know Webpack does that. We don't really do it. And I'm like, okay, well, how big is how big is that main bundle? So I think that like, even if you don't know specifically how to implement things, I think just like being aware of what causes these big issues is really vital for everyone on the team, just to be like, understanding like bundle size, like over the wire, like people on bad connections, the bigger the bundle, the longer it's going to take, stuff like that, I think is really good, because it's so easy. I mean, like people will always talk about like a number, like Google will be like, you should have, less than 250 kilobytes or whatever of like compressed JavaScript. But I've worked on a lot of like small projects, that not like a search engine, but like a small external web app. And like, they can shoot up like, so it is so easy to get 5 megabytes of JavaScript in that bundle. Like it is so easy to do that. So I think that like having discussions on your team, or like having some, whether it's like CI or you do like a manual audit once a quarter, something like that, I think is really vital for everyone to be aware of, even if it's okay to just have like 1 or 2 perf people that, actually help implement the fixes, because the fixes can be complicated, right? Like moving things to peer dependencies or working with other teams to not duplicate stuff, that can be more complicated. But I think it's really important just to be aware of it, because things get out of hand and then either customers leave, or like more often at big companies, people just are like, well, the mobile apps are way better, they're way faster, right? And it's like, well, it's not a shortcoming of like the technology, like it's not web or React or Angular's fault. It's just like, it gets so easy to npm install something, add it to your Webpack build, and then hey, it works, and ship. So
Right.
and combining that with like having, I think part of it's just empathy too. Like if you're in San Francisco on a MacBook Pro on like a T3 connection or whatever, then it's like you're like, oh, site loads fast for me. I think it's important to remember that people are on like much worse hardware, much worse connections, much farther away,
Totally.
those kind of things. So yeah,
I've heard a friend of mine said they worked at a company where they would, on Tuesdays or something, they would throttle.
Yeah, we did that at Twitter for a while. I can't remember who started it. Maybe Facebook. Somebody started it, and I really liked that. Maybe it was Facebook or Google, but I think that's really cool. Like, build empathy. And at Twitter, when we did it, we would do it for everyone, so not just engineering. So PMs and designers, and like we throttle the corporate network. Yeah, I think that can be really cool. And even when I teach DevTools, people ask about the throttling, like, well, why would I ever use this? And it's like trying to like kind of instill that, like, well, this is really what it's like for a lot of folks. A lot of people like on like very old hardware, bad connections, like still every bit as valuable of a customer, every bit of potential lead, as anyone else. But yeah. So yeah, I think it's really important that it's just the awareness. Like that's what I always try to get in with the DevTools. Like just be aware of these issues and how they come up, and you don't need to remember exactly how to fix all of them, but just be like, hey, is our bundle getting too big? Or like, hey, is our are these interactions taking too long? Do we maybe have a memory leak? Like, are users complaining about the app getting slower over time? Stuff like that.
Totally. You brought up a really good point about the person being on a maybe slower connection is just as valuable of a lead. And you could almost argue from a business perspective, they're more valuable of a lead, because they're going to tell all of their network, wow, this is a horrible experience, don't use them, right? Where the MacBook Pro San Francisco internet speed is like, it's kind of assumed, like, it should be fast. So then they don't really say much.
Yeah. And I think we see that a lot, like in places that have slow or spotty internet connection. I think that you see a lot of ingenuity, and among that is like, if you come out with a faster competitor, I think it's really easy to dominate a market. Because I always pitch the DevTools stuff from 2 sides. Like one is like the compassion, empathy, like for really vital, right? To be like, hey, let's make a good experience for everybody. But then it's like, if you're really trying to sell it up the ladder and that's not working, like, there's huge market opportunities. Like just because there's a city with slow internet doesn't mean they're not going to buy premium subscriptions of whatever your software is, or buy cars, or buy, whatever it is. So yeah, I think there's like both sides really important, just to have some minimum. And again, I see people like agonizing over these like micro optimizations all the time, when it's like, you really do look at some of these like big company websites, and they're just like, gargantuan bundles, or like 2 copies, just stuff that's like really easy fixes, you know what I mean? Like really, really easy stuff that's just kind of gotten out of control over the years.
Totally. No, that's great. I'm really glad we're tying in like business value and performance
Yeah.
to that. Something I've been doing engineering for about 6 years, and more recently just focused on front end. And something I want to do is focus more on performance. So let's say someone watches this, they're a front end engineer somewhere, and they're like, wow, we don't have a performance first culture. Where's a good place for them to start? Like either investigating their own app or education, because it seems to be really overwhelming, right? There's like all of these things that you can optimize, but
Yeah.
to gain experience, you really need to be in the weeds. So like, what would you recommend someone do?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a really good call. So in my experience, it really differs. Like a little bit of it is just knowing your company, like knowing your company's culture. So like, for example, there's some places, and even teams within companies, like there were teams I was on at Adobe where when I would bring up performance, I would have managers that were like, oh, if you would tackle that, like I'll clear your whole sprint. Like if you could take a look at that, like we've been meaning to do that forever, or we don't know how, or something like that. And then there's other ones where it's like, I'm like, you're seeing this, right? Like it's horrible. And they're like, yeah, it's a little slow. I'm like, no, it's really slow. And they're like, so I think a little bit of it is like trying to figure out your pitch. I think that there are also just there's low hanging fruit a lot of the time. Like for example, like going and doing a lighthouse audit on your site and then printing that out or something like that, and just going over it in a stand up to be like, hey, like some of these suggestions are like dead simple. You know what I mean? Where it's just like, like some of the things like, oh, our bundle like Webpack, we could split it out really quickly, or like, hey, everybody's bundling their own version of the design system. Like if we move those to peer dependencies, that would speed things up a lot. So I think hitting those first is really good, because I think that the tougher ones are just by nature a much harder sell. It's also a little tricky where it's like, does your site need to convert? Like, what are you working on? People work on such a diverse range of projects, right? Where like, if you work on a search engine, it's an easy sell, right? If you're like, hey, more searches, for sure, like more searches, like, when you start working on these like internal applications, like I've seen them struggle that are like kind of tertiary applications or secondary applications, where it's like, oh, this is like the ad review submission page for Twitter, and it's like, it's super important, but it's mostly like ad executive. People start coming up with these excuses, and I see this for accessibility too, where it's like, oh, this one's not so used, or stuff like that. So I do think it can be a little bit tricky. I also think like sneaking in performance stuff is kind of an art for engineers, like sneaking in the stuff that you want to work on, to be like, oh, okay, like, well, you need me to add this feature, I'm going to push back a little bit, and I want 2 more story points. I'll still add the feature, but I also, while I'm in there, want to improve like some of these things. Like I want to compress some of these images, or I want to, I think the last thing I would say is, if you're ever trying to win something like an argument, or get some time or get some resources for something, I think like, what can you automate? Like that's where I always look first. Like what can you do in CI? Because it's so easy for a manager to tell you like, oh, we don't have time right now. We're doing feature development. We don't have time for that. But if they just let you add a CI check that fails branches if the lighthouse score goes below 70 or something like that, then all of a sudden it's not, oh, hey, so and so wants to do this. It's like, hey, the build's broken, right? Like that's such a much easier sell, where it's like, hey, we need the on-call to look into why the build's broken, and like maybe the build's broken because you have a performance audit or something like that. Right. So for pretty much anything, I always try to automate whatever I can, like get it into CI, get it into a PR check, like something like that is always like, that's always like my first step if you're not having easy inroads with management.
Awesome. And then so that's like the work process soft skills perspective, and then from the hard skills perspective, to get started, like, do you recommend just kind of diving in, or do you recommend doing like your course on front end masters, or like what's the 80-20 of knowing what you don't know?
Yeah, I think I hope my course is really useful, but I would say that the Lighthouse scores, which are now built into DevTools, are like the perfect starting place. Like the first thing you should do is, boot up Chrome, run a Lighthouse full audit, like a, maybe even like a mobile audit on your site, and take a real look at those, that because they not only give you great advice, but they're like a central place. They link out to all sorts of great articles and explainers and videos and stuff like that. So I think that's like, in the short, that would be like the first place that I would go for sure, is check that out.
Awesome. Piggybacking off what you said about the sell of performance improvements from a non-engineering business perspective, what's the performance? What's the direct correlation between performance and business improvement or sales?
Yeah, so I think there's one place that's a good start. I would say there's always like really fascinating data that gets done pretty much annually on like, stuff like, oh, if users have to wait more than 100 milliseconds, the 10% will leave, and if they have to wait, so like I think Chrome has like the Rail site, their Rail model that they use, and like they have a bunch of good stuff there. I know like the WordPress plugin W3 Total Cache also has a bunch of great statistics on it, where it's like, hey, like, Amazon saw this decrease in traffic from the, so I think some of that's really good start to be like, hey, like people don't wait, they feel it, it feels slower, things like that. I also really think that like, over the years, I feel like I've gotten a little bit better at selling performance and tech debt and stuff like that, because if you work at a big company, especially, like you really see the effects when stuff builds up. Like you really get to that point where it's like, you ship a bunch of features for 2 years really fast, ignoring performance, ignoring tech debt. And then, people know what that team is like, right? People are leaving, quitting the company or moving on to other teams, features to all of a sudden take 2 or 3 times as long. These kind of things happen. So I really think like, I'd sell it a little bit the business end of like users will leave, like customers will leave, but then I'd also sell it like that it's really important for the team. Like it's really important that the team is working on, stuff that they feel good about. And whether that's like logic refactors or performance refactors, I think those things like they have really substantial impact, and they're sneaky. Like, you'll feel like everything's fine, and then all of a sudden it's like, what's going, like you'll have a VP that's like, what is going on? Why haven't you built this yet? It's like, oh, well, we had to redo our whole, this, so I think that like keeping the like, I don't know what you call them, but like the first level management. So like a PM, a EM, something like that, aware of the effect that letting those things slip could have on like the VP or like senior EM level, where they're like, this is unacceptable, this needs to be faster, is like, is important too. Because it's true, when by the time the VP notices that your site is awful on their really fast connection, it's going to take a long time to fix at that point, right? You're like, oh, we've just been doing terrible stuff for years. So I kind of try to sell both. Again, not in a fear mongering way, but in a no. Apps need to stay healthy, and this is like an important part of being healthy. I've also had good luck with like, it depends on the team, but like trying to sell a culture of like, well, what if we don't give the on-call person any tasks, and then the on-call person can pick up like user bug reports, performance tickets, accessibility, stuff that maybe has been slipping long-term. I've had really good luck with that too, because we're not really asking for a delay or to kick a feature. We're more just like, hey, what if we did this kind of culture thing where whoever's on call for the week or the 2 weeks or whatever gets to like kind of pick from this, backlog of stuff. So I've had good luck with that at Adobe. Awesome. We did that, and I think it worked out nice.
Awesome. And so kind of like taking this one step further, let's say someone goes through those steps, and then you're kind of talking, maybe it's a smaller company, and then you're like, hey, we need to have a healthy app because of the reasons you just described, and engineering experience and productivity and things that you can measure long term. But they're like, yeah, I don't care. Like, so. And so how do you, then you have to like push data into it and be like, so how do you take maybe customer drop, like the mental model, or even the actual presentation of how do you measure the user, maybe bounce rate, experience, etc., and then do a performance improvement so that you can then say like, hey, check this out, like I actually saw business improvement. You have to give me, like, that's my justification of I'm not doing random work. We need to move forward.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's tricky because it sort of depends on what infrastructure you have. So like, the easy way to do it would be if you have good analytics and a good A/B testing system. So like, for example, at Twitter, we had really good analytics of all the events, like, bounce rates, time to first paint, like, users, number of actions they would, everything, right? We just log it all. And so then it was really easy to run performance experiments, just to run one, right? So we'd run one, we'd make like one query faster, or we'd make like a certain page, maybe like the settings page, we'd really optimize it. And then you can really show the data with like an experiment framework, right? You can be like, oh, like, less bounces, more hits than we were getting, more actions per hit, things like that. It gets tricky though, because I would have to feel like if you have a team that pushes back and says we don't really care about performance, it's probably more likely that they don't have a great A/B testing system or experimentation framework. So it does get trickier there.
Okay.
I still think pushing for those first. So like pushing, like for an example, like if I'm like at a job and maybe not even a front end thing, like something simple, like one of our microservices is too slow. So it's like not super fruitful to be like, hey, you're too slow, we need you to be faster, or like that seems like fighting or something like that. So maybe the thing you do is just try to get buy-in. Like, could we just get an SLA for our production services? Like something really generous, like 300 milliseconds or something like that. And it's like all of them should fall in there. And then you could start logging, right? You could start like get like a Splunk account or some open source thing where you could start really logging stuff. Sentry, New Relic, something like that. Again, back to my original point of like, if you, instead of fighting, and I know this sounds like bratty, but I don't mean it that way. I mean like agree on something good and then automate it. And then it's not you arguing, it's just you saying like, you said 300 milliseconds was good, you're averaging 400 milliseconds, like that's I'm calling a outage, like that's a problem, so I do think that like trying to get buy-in on the goal and then automate the checking is really great, because then you're not really fighting with anybody. You're just kind of like having an open dialogue about these things, because I do think that people know, like when a service is down or when a website is slow, you talk to the team lead or the manager, like even if they're really hungry for features, like they know it's getting slow.
Right.
So I really love automating stuff. Can you add an A/B testing framework? Can you add some kind of open source logging that you can log every request? Can you add better analytics? Any of that stuff? Can you add a really good CI pipeline that checks all this stuff? Runs your tests, things like that. Awesome. I love that stuff. Like I really like. Again, like with test coverage, same thing. Rather than like dictating 100% or whatever, like if you can get buy-in to set up a CI log that just fails a PR that lowers the coverage, like that's so much easier. Then people are not getting hounded. They're just like, oh, I got to add some tests to get this.
Right.
Nice and easy.
It's very, you made a really good correlation between the like CI and performance infrastructure with testing, and the same thing with linting, right? Like I don't want to have an argument about what your function looks like every pull request review.
Yep. And like I was a tech lead at Adobe, and I had rules against that. Like you can't be flagging PRs with your own opinions. Like we either need to lint it and all agree and then lint it, or just let those things slide, because that's so demoralizing. People are like trying to get contributions, and then you're like, hey, could you add a space after this bracket or whatever? It's like no, we're not doing that. Like we'll automate these things so we all agree, and then we'll move on, because I don't like that. It gets really nitpicky and people are getting slowed down or bullied, or like it's not fair. So yeah, same thing with performance. Like as opposed to just having discussions, like try to get anything you can in CI is like always my go-to way.
Awesome. Cool. No, that was really good. This is a pretty big question.
All right.
But my last question, because I left some time for it. Where do you think the future of front-end engineering is going from I have my own opinions and I'd love to hear yours from at a company perspective, right? Like not what the market is going to dictate, but like you get into a job in the next 5 to 10 years. How do you see front-end engineering shifting?
Yeah, it's really good. So much going on that's interesting. Like one thing that I see that I think is going to be big is that I think from the design side, like the tools are getting so good that I think there's going to be much better relationships. Like people that build things in Figma, like it just translates so easily to web. And I love that, like, because that's not necessarily creative work. Is like if you're the designer and you make it 10 pixels high by like 1 black pixel border, and then I have to like go guess at it and maybe I don't get it right, like that's not fun, right? So I do think that like the working relationships, like being able to export like JSX or being able to export HTML and CSS or whatever, like I think those are doing really well, which I think will have a big shift in what like front-end engineers do. I also think that tools like, I think that it's a temporary measure, like that companies would want to hire like a Webpack engineer or like a Babel expert, or like I think those are implementation details ultimately. And while they're important right now, like my hope is in the next five. This kind of answers the question you asked and the one you said you weren't asking, but I do think they're tied together. Like I think that as the tools get better, there won't be jobs that exist right now doing those things. Like there won't be somebody that's like, hey, figure out why Webpack's being so slow. You'll just have way better tooling for like your linting, your typing, your tests, like all that stuff. So I hope then that front end engineering will be a lot more on your product. I mean, that's like the goal, right? Is to get into your business logic as fast as possible.
Right.
Same thing with like design systems are like getting so much better and borrowing work from each other, that my dream would really be coming to a job and like the pipelines are super fast and really good. You know, no more messing with that stuff. And CI is dead simple to set up. You get great specs from your designers where stuff is like all kind of designed, and you can get right into building, you know, the actual interesting thing, like, you know, actually adding sharing or adding, you know, like a cool image sizer, you know, whatever it is you're building.
Totally.
That's kind of my hope. I think at the same time, though, technology is also going to get massively more complicated. While things that are complicated today will get easier, I think there's going to be new things. So I think that like all this stuff happening like at edge now, like the idea of like Cloudflare workers and Lambda and all these things, like I think things will get a little bit more complicated to build when they all need to be like, you know, these like kind of serverless like edge, you know, like Lambda functions or whatever. So I think things will shift. But my real hope is that a lot of the like annoying, like in the weeds stuff that every company's doing right now, like upgrading TypeScript or like upgrading Babel or like some Webpack config, like I hope that goes away. And we get to spend a lot more time on like, the business logic, because there's performance there too, right? Like doing things in efficient ways that can't be automated. So I hope there's a lot more fun building your app, and everybody has an easier time getting an app started, you know, that kind of thing.
Totally. And yeah, you see that with like Create React App.
And
it's
Bedrock
like
that just came out.
Yeah, before that, even just setting up a Next.js application, like before that, it was like, wait, what do I have to do to get JSX supported? And how is this being rendered?
I can't tell you how many like Hack Week projects have just like died on that, where it's like, you know what, never mind. Like I don't really want to do that. So I really do hope that it's just going to get better and better. Well, you'll have this like lightning fast, works on Mac, Linux, Windows, you know, full support. And I think you see it. I mean, like the builders, the bundlers, you know, the type systems, they're all getting so much better that I really hope you just, exactly like Create React App, but just does everything, you know, sets up like a GraphQL instance. And I don't know if you checked out Bedrock, but it does a lot of that stuff, which is like, it's pretty cool. It just launched like a few months ago.
Oh, cool.
But yeah, I'm hopeful for that. I'm hopeful to just spend a lot more of my day doing the actual, I mean, that's what PMs want. Like I want to live like they live, where I just am not worried about my bundle getting too big. I'm just like, they think of something, I go build that thing with design. That's the dream. So
totally.
I'm hopeful about that getting better.
That's awesome. Yeah, I completely agree with you. You kind of brought up the point about like having specialists, right? Like with Webpack, people that analyze your Webpack, but that might not be around in the future. I also think, like you said, there's going to be kind of like performance isn't a new thing, but it's being talked about more and more and more, because we have more I think we have more measurements of business value and how much like user experience, money coming in, et cetera, and that we can attribute to that. It's going to be more, in my opinion, it's going to be, you have to have more assumed knowledge in the front end ecosystem about performance, security, these types of things. But the low hanging fruit will hopefully be taken care of for you, so you can think about the actual issues.
Yeah, I do agree. And I already think that's true. Like, I think you see a lot of people who were more like UI engineering, which used to be really big, you know, so like real HTML, CSS experts being kind of bombarded at work with like, like you said, security, performance, you know, all these questions where it's like, oh, you wasn't doing that before. So I do think asking for more is happening, but my hope is like at least that some other stuff is alleviated, where it's like, you know, better package management, better bundling, better tooling, stuff like that. But I do think that, and there's a lot to web, like there's a lot to front end web, like, like you said, like just considering, all the security stuff, and that you're just like the user facing, but you're also stitching together all these services. And then it's like knowing when to ask for a new service that ties together other services. And so like, like browser HTTP packet limitation. There's just a lot to like get into. So, but I do hope that, yeah, we can just focusing on more interesting problems, I feel like should always be the goal. So hopefully that continues to happen.
Awesome. Yeah, I want to relate this to like styled components, and people are like, yeah, let's put styles in JSX. And I'm not against it. It's just, I'm like going off on a tangent, but it's like, it's one of those things that it's like, we're like improving, but then you start building things that the components get so bloated. And then you're like,
Yeah.
this could have just been like a container with a flexbox attribute. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
man.
It's interesting because those things are so complicated, because I think what often happens is like the original library is like super useful and really like good. And then people will like, not that they're misusing the library, but they'll use it like in a very complex way. And then they'll make like parent libraries that kind of sit on top of it and do more and more things. And then, yeah, then you see those examples, right? Where it's like, just some ridiculous amount of like CSX or classes or something like that. For something that's like, yeah, like display flex, right? Or something like that.
Right. Yeah.
What's going on here? But there's interesting stuff like twitter.com is an interesting story. So like if you open twitter.com, it's like it's all divs like across the board with these generated classes. And so a lot of people like HTML experts will be like, this is ridiculous. Like semantic web is better and accessibility is better with semantic elements. And like all these things are true. But when you dig a little deeper, you see that like Twitter had this goal of being able to compile for both web and React Native. That was like their goal, to be this app that was both the mobile app and the web app in like a big way. So they came up with this library that would abstract the like markup layer away, so it would render in both platforms. And so the library adds all the accessibility stuff back, like the focus control, the screen reader support, all that stuff. So I do agree things get like silly sometimes, where it's like, what, like this, there was a thing already for this. But I also think that when you see something silly, like maybe 7 times out of 10, there's actually a really cool and interesting story behind it. Totally. And the 3 times out of 10, some poor soul was just following some tutorial they saw online, but they didn't understand the context there, right? Or it's just like, but I do agree. Like, I still think that like accessibility, HTML, CSS are like vitally important. And I think that like, yeah, like linters there, using the right elements. Like, I mean, I see it all the time. Like I'll see like, a link turned into a button, or like a div turned into a button, or like an H3 made to look really, big or something like that, instead of using it, just like these different things where it's just like, hey, like, there's more to these than their size. Like you can resize an H1, but it needs to be the top level header is an H1. Like, so I do think that there's a really valid point there. Like we need to better understand our tools instead of just creating new ones.
Right.
But I also think there's some really cool stuff you can do if you just push a little bit, to be like, what if we, okay, like let's put this to the side for a second. Like, could we really have something that shipped on, desktop, mobile, both mobile platforms and web, all one code base? What would that look like? I think that's like interesting to poke around with.
Totally. Awesome. Gee, it was a big question.
Yeah, I know it's a good question too. And there's a lot of stuff that's like, I don't know, that I've been very excited about lately. So it's really interesting to see what effect it has on the ecosystem.
Awesome. Well, I want to be mindful of your time. Before we go, where can people find you, courses you have, anything you want to promote?
Yeah, just, so not working right now, but I'm JKUP on all the things. So Twitter and GitHub and all that stuff. I have 2 courses on frontendmasters.com, one on web accessibility, one on devtools. And then I blog at JONkuperman.com. So I write as much as I can over there, but that's about it for me though.
Awesome. Cool. Well, thank you so much.
I really appreciate it. Yeah, it was great chatting. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you.
All right, take care.
Bye.